My name is Jacopo. I'm, again, lead software engineer at GoDaddy. Today, I want to talk about Node and give like a little history of what, how Node.Js evolved, in the past 10 to 12 years. And, mostly like talk as well why I think Node.js is the perfect ecosystem, gives like the right tools, and it's the right platform for quickly build almost any type of product. The presentation, the agenda for this talk, it's like 20 minutes presentation. I'm gonna have like hopefully 5 minutes Q&A. If I run over time, I will be around so you guys can ask me questions on the application chat. Before going to details, I want to give statistics and number overview of what Node.js is today. So Node is the fastest growing open source platform in the world. It counts more than twice as many models as the next competitor, which is Java. And there are more than 1 million models published on NPM. NPM is the Node.js public registry. And there are about 450 new packages that are published daily on the registry, which is pretty interesting number. Node has an estimated 10 million users, and it's growing at 50% per year, which means that if we keep this growth, like we could expect like 50 million users in the next 12 months. And something that is also very interesting is the fact that 80% of the Node.js users have 3 years or less experience with Node, which means two things. On one hand, that Node is embracing into the ecosystem experienced programmers, but coming from different other programming languages, such as like Java or Python or C++. But on the other hand, also means that Node is embracing into the ecosystem like unexperienced programmers that just graduated from university. Different companies in the Silicon Valley, but all over around the world, use Node.js in production. To mention few: Google, PayPal, GoDaddy, eBay, but there are like several hundreds out there that you can easily find with a simple Google search. A little bit of history about Node. Ryan Dahl started working on Node in 2009. He was concerned about web server speed. The initial release was support only Linux and macOS. And in 2015, something really important happened in the history of Node. It was like the Node.js Foundation was announced. And then thanks to Node.js Foundation, there are a lot of important. One probably the most important event was the merge, like the iOS and Node.js core forks that merged back together, and the Node.js 4 version was released in September 2015. As today, June 2020, we have 12.18 that just got released. And it's the current LTS version. So what is Node.js? Node.js is a runtime for JavaScript. This means that with Node, you can run JavaScript server-side. And something that it's very interesting about Node is the fact that it has non-blocking I/O operations, which are basically asynchronous operation out of the box. Means that when you read a file out of the file system, or you write some data on a socket, on a network socket, that operation does not block the rest of your program, the rest of your code. And this happens thanks to a very key concept in Node, which is called the event loop. And the event loop is the system that in Node.js offloads operation to the system kernel whenever it's possible. And because modern kernels today are multi-threaded, they can handle multiple operations in background for us. And when an operation completes, the kernel tells Node and the associated callback, which is a function associated with that asynchronous operation. It's called and it's triggered to process the result that comes from the kernel. For instance, like let's say you want to read a file, you start reading a file, the kernel read your file in background, and then when the data from the file is ready to be processed, a function that is associated with that operation is called, and then you can do whatever you want in your code with the data that comes from the file, parsing or like some data string manipulation and things like that. But something that I want to emphasize with this presentation is the fact that Node.js is not just a runtime for JavaScript, but is also a very very broad full stack ecosystem. Node finds application from web frontend to mobile and tablet development, desktop development, cloud backends, of course, IoT devices, third-party APIs, and service-oriented architectures, and recently blockchain and decentralized applications. Node is the perfect platform to deal with these all components because Node brings the accessibility and ubiquity of the web platform and of JavaScript to all these different areas. And one plus is that you can use Node in a variety of different places across teams, which makes it really great when you have multiple teams in your organization. These teams can share libraries, they can share code reviews, they can share a lot of interesting tools out there that can make the code development faster. Starting from frontend, web frontend has drastically changed in the past 20 years. The community have developed amazing tool in Node and JavaScript to help developers building very performant front-end applications. We have Babel for transpiling your JavaScript code from ES6 to ES5, standard and ESLint to help maintain code quality with ease, JS Hint to help detect errors and potential problems in your JavaScript code, Style, Slash, and other post-CSS tools for helping developers to write better CSS. And then we had so many tools that the community basically wrote more tools to help manage all these tools, right? Examples are GAP, Browserify, and Webpack, which probably comes out with a big winning compared to the previous two. Talking about frontend, I think today we have to mention React. React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. The project started at Facebook around 2011 and was publicly released under MIT license, if I remember correctly, in 2013. And it retold front-end frameworks very differently. The way React works, the main idea behind React is that a web framework should exist in this compile chain where we have access to all the Node.js API and tools. And talking about React, something that fits very well in building frontend, even if it has a backend component, is GraphQL. Many of you might know already what GraphQL is, but if you're not, GraphQL is a data query language that initially was developed by Facebook and then publicly released in 2015. Today, it's the Apollo team that leads the GraphQL community. The Apollo team is the same team that is behind Meteor.js. And GraphQL provides an alternative to REST and ad hoc web service architectures. Fundamentally, it has three operations: the queries, the mutations, and the subscriptions. So the queries are the operation that allow a client to fetch data from a server. Mutations are the operations that allow a client to update or write data on a server. And then the subscription are the operations that allow a client to subscribe for certain changes on a piece of data. So that instead of constantly polling the server and asking, is this data change? If yes, just give me the new data. you can just like leave a connection open and just tell to the server, hey, whenever this data change, just send me the data, send me the new data down to the wire. And so this makes things faster and also more performant in terms of bandwidth, because you don't have this constant polling operations that has this HTTP overhead on top. One other key point, like one other very key feature in GraphQL, it's the fact that the APIs return all data your application need in a single request. And this makes things faster and again more performant in terms of like bandwidth, because in one single request you can get all the data that you need. While, for instance, if you're using a REST API, you might have to eat different endpoints to gather all the data that you need. And each of these HTTP requests that you might not be able to do in parallel and you have to do sequentially has HTTP overhead, and it has, of course, like a latency round trip time. Finally, like something that also GraphQL makes it easier to evolve APIs over the time, because the API is organized in terms of type and fields and not endpoints anymore. Mobile and tablet development, there is still, there is a lot of going on in this area. People build mobile application and tablet applications every day. Two main projects here, even if probably like Cordova, it's, I mention it because it's like the father of like hybrid development, but it's probably less used nowadays. So it's Apache Cordova, also previously known as PhoneGap. Cordova makes you build application with only HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And the Cordova apps are also defined as mobile web apps because you use all these web components and web APIs. It targets multi-platforms with one single code base, which is great. You write your you write your code only once, and then you can deploy it and bundle it into native containers for all the different platforms out there, from like iOS to Android and Windows Phone. And it's free open source, of course. But probably something that is much more powerful and is much more fashionable today, it's React Native. React Native lets you build native applications with only JavaScript, as the same design pattern as React, but you're not building a mobile web app, you're building like a native app. React Native use the same UI building blocks as regular iOS and Android apps. I don't think there is a support for Windows Phone, so you just have to build, you can just use React Native for Android and iOS. Desktop development is not dead. People still want to build desktop applications. There are tools out there that in the Node.js that are part of the Node.js ecosystem that makes this process easier. The major platform for hybrid desktop development today, it's probably Electron, previously known as Atom Shell, and then refactored and renamed into Electron. Electron merges Chromium with Node.js. It brings the web platform and the entire ecosystem, Node ecosystem, to desktop development. What you're building here is desktop web app. You're using HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, a little bit like in Cordova for building like a desktop application. Your code, your HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, it's bundled into a native container, and plus you have all access to all the Node.js API for doing things like exposing a web server if you need one, or like opening a WebSocket or reading from the file system and things like that. Cloud backends. So Node was built to build backends. Of course, Node.js was built for building APIs. Therefore, he always had a great cloud story. every well-known cloud provider support Node out of the box and has pretty good Node.js support, from like Google App Engine to Elastic Beanstalk, Heroku, and other services that other cloud platforms have. Talking about backends, I want to mention serverless and function as a service. Nowadays, we are moving into this function as a service, aka serverless space, where developers can build their applications out of like these discrete functions. Of course, this function actually run on a server. There is a pretty decent infrastructure behind that runs this piece of code. The reason why it has been called serverless is that as a software engineer, you don't have to worry about managing the infrastructure that runs this function, but it's more just like focusing on writing the code that you need to achieve your application goals. So you might be wondering what's the relationship here between Node and function as a service. Is that Node.js has been cloud vendor choice #1 for serverless because Node is optimized to run in a single process with a very limited memory space, and it's really good at handling like a lot of I/O stuff. It's really fast. These are very important requirements for successfully running into this cloud function service, where you need a really fast startup timing, and you want to really be efficient in.
Hello. Hi. Hi. How are you?
Sorry.
Great. How are you?
I'm having a little problem here.
Okay, so we have you going on at 1 p.m. my time, before p.m. That's right. So let's go ahead. Oh my gosh.
I'm hearing the backstage. I'm hearing all the backstage people talking right now, so I can't talk.
Jacopo, I think you have an extra tab open.
Yeah.
Sorry guys, I'm hearing all the backstage.
Have been the best one so far.
I guess this is like the little inconvenience of.
Okay. So wait a second. Are you clicking these slides or am I? You are. Huh. Yeah, I know, it's weird. It's actually. Were they moving on their own? Yes, it never has done that before. I'm going to make sure that it doesn't do that again. Let me try this.
Okay, so I just realized that I had an extra tab open, so I was keep hearing like people from the backstage talking. So I was like, what the hell is going on? All right, so sorry about that. I guess like I'm not really used to do all this remote conferences. So bringing back to where I was, serverless and function as a service. So again, like I think one thing that is funny is that Moore's law is still making computer faster, but we are keeping optimizing resources using less and less of these computers to run our applications. And this makes totally sense because we're trying to reduce our costs and increase our profits. So another interesting area where Node.js finds application is IoT. It's IoT devices. I'm not surprised that today, like where we have like folks like Elon Musk, they're making Tesla cars that go faster than a Ferrari, and then take these cars and put them into space with a rocket that can be reused and can land back to Earth. Where we have like everyone that wants a button to do everything, right? So starting in 2012, the Node ecosystem started to see a big rise in robots. And because of that, like people working at Nodebots built a framework to build robots in JavaScript called Johnny 5. And the project was very successful. He had more than 75 developers contributing to the project and still working on it. Third-party APIs and service-oriented architecture is another area where like Node.js has a lot of weights in it. And the reason is because today everyone uses APIs to build their applications. It's unlikely that you're gonna rebuild a text message service or an email service. You might just gonna use, if your application needs, you might just gonna use one of the services available. And this services has an HTTP API, or sometimes a little bit more complex API that use different protocols. But overall, like, you're gonna have like a Node.js SDK that you can just npm install, eventually configure it with an SDK key if it's necessary, and then you can just start using the functionality of your of this API into your application. And finally, blockchain and decentralized apps are another very emerging space where Node find application. So in short, if you're not familiar with what a blockchain or a DApp is, a blockchain is a distributed list of records called blocks linked using cryptography. And a blockchain network is a network of computer nodes that speak a protocol that decide how to transact on the blockchain. And an example of blockchain network is Ethereum or Bitcoin, right? A decentralized application is a computer program that runs on a blockchain network. And decentralized application could be very disruptive for different reasons. Just to mention a few is the fact that no one can shut down your decentralized application. Once the app is deployed, Google can come and say, oh, you know what, we're going to shut it down. It's deployed and it's there to stay. The apps are probably more fault tolerant than AWS itself. Also, decentralized applications are open source, difficult to be, right? So everyone can have access to the source code and can see how the app it's implemented. So there are two big projects that I think it's really interesting to see as a Node.js developers. Is Truffle. Truffle is a development environment, testing framework, and asset pipeline for Ethereum. It's written in JavaScript. The contracts for blockchain are written in Solidity, which is a contract-oriented high-level language, very similar, influenced by C++ and Python and JS. And it offers built-in smart contract compilation, linking, deployment, and binary management. And the cool stuff is that if you're familiar with Mock and Chai, you can write your unit tests for your Solidity contract using these two frameworks, and more like two libraries. And therefore, it means you can write your JavaScript. You can write your tests in JS. And finally, it's Web3.js. Web3.js is a collection of libraries which allow your application to interact with an Ethereum node using HTTP, WebSocket, and IPC connection, or an IPC connection. And it's very useful when you're building functionality in your application that needs to communicate with a blockchain network. So why I love working with Node? Node does not just make programming easier, if it's probably one of the main reason why I love working with Node. So yeah, I would say Node is makes programming easier. It's great, but it's not just about making programming easier. It's about drastically reducing entry barriers for everyone to come and work on all these different areas of technologies, from web frontend to backends and IoT and blockchain applications. So I think it's one of the main advantages of being a Node.js engineer is the ability to just go around all these different areas of technology and being able to build stuff, which is really cool. So this was it. It was kind of an interesting experience for me to doing a remote conference. I'm looking forward to get questions over the event chat, and I have a few minutes I can answer these questions, and I will be also around in the next let's say 30-40 minutes in the chat.